I never thought I'd hear my own brother tell me, with a smug grin twisting across his face, that I'd survive without our family's inheritance. Yet there I stood, in the middle of our parents' old living room, heart hammering so loudly I could barely hear him speak. Mom's antique clock, the one she'd cherished for years, ticked on the mantel as if counting down to the moment my life would change forever. And it did. Because in that instant, fingers curled tight around the letter containing our father's last will, my brother William reached over, snatched what should have been divided between us, and tossed me a sneer that still burns in my memory. "You'll survive," he said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "You always do." For a second my vision blurred with shock. Our father had just been laid to rest. Our mother, gone years before him. William and I were supposed to be each other's last living link to the life we'd known. Instead, he was tearing away what was rightfully mine, rightfully ours, and spitting it back in my face. I could almost hear Dad's voice echoing in my head, reminding me that family came before everything, that William and I should look out for each other. But Dad's wisdom had always fallen on William's deaf ears. He'd been the rebellious one, the gambler, the risk-taker, constantly in trouble, always in debt, always expecting an easy way out. Meanwhile, I was the caretaker, the mediator, the dutiful daughter who stayed at home to manage the bills and keep Dad's affairs in order when his health started to fail. I'd put my own life on pause for our father. I'd handled his finances when his eyesight grew weak, looked after the estate, taken him to doctor's appointments, done all the tasks William never found time for. And Dad thanked me in his own quiet ways, sometimes with a soft pat on my shoulder, a grateful smile. But in the end, I'd never asked for a reward. I didn't expect one either. I just wanted our family to stay together. But when Dad's will was read, William claimed nearly everything. There was a hush in the lawyer's office that day as the man explained that the final distribution might be contested, that certain aspects of the estate required proof of Dad's intended percentages. My father's mind had been fading in his final year. A swirl of contradictory documents appeared. Then, out of nowhere, William presented a single updated will, suspiciously typed, witnessed by one of his shady friends, that gave almost every cent, every property, every stock, every heirloom to him. To my shock, the entire estate seemed transferred into William's name, leaving me the barest scraps of Dad's fortune. I remembered standing up from that squeaky leather chair in the lawyer's office, swallowing the dryness in my throat. "This can't be right," I said, hearing the tremble in my own voice. "Dad would never cut me out entirely." He wouldn't." William shrugged, adjusting the stiff collar on his suit. "Guess he changed his mind when he realized who'd run the estate best." I stared at him in disbelief. "Run it best? You're in debt." "You?" The lawyer cut me off with a raised hand. "There's evidence that your father wanted to revise his testament, Miss Thompson. But I'm afraid this final draft William produced supersedes those older statements, unless you can prove it was falsified." And William turned to me, cold and unrelenting, as if challenging me to try. It was in his gaze, this dare. "Go ahead, see if you can stand against me." I considered fighting him legally, but attorneys cost money that I didn't have. Everything was tied up in Dad's estate, an estate now under William's thumb. So in that living room, the day William officially took possession of the property, I cornered him one last time. I asked him to do the right thing, maybe not hand it all over to me, but at least share. Dad had always said we'd split it fairly, half for William, half for me. That was the plan from the time I was a kid. He stared at me with contempt. "You'll survive," he repeated, "and I'm done watching you play victim." Those words lodged in my heart like shards of glass. I left that house with tears brimming, angry, ashamed, determined never to let him see me break. If he thought I would fold under the weight of betrayal, he was about to learn how wrong he was. Because while William might have stolen Dad's fortune, he'd overlooked one crucial thing: me. In the weeks following, I had to make painful choices. My small apartment, which I'd been renting with money Dad gave me for caretaking duties, was suddenly expensive. Every cost loomed taller. I had no job, no real savings. My time had been consumed by caring for our father. My small nest egg vanished under the weight of monthly bills. The humiliation stung. I'd grown used to living modestly but securely, trusting the promise that Dad's inheritance would provide for us both when he was gone. Now, I was alone, with just a few $1,000s to my name. I couldn't sleep. At night, I'd lie in bed, eyes open, memories swirling. Dad's final days in the hospital, the beep of machines, his fragile hand in mine as he whispered about regrets. His regret about William's attitude, the wasted potential, the heartbreak. "Just promise me," Dad had said, "you'll always try to keep William close. Don't let him drift too far, he's your brother." I'd promised. But how could I keep him close when he was the one ripping us apart? Friends told me I should fight. "Sue him," one said. "Expose him," said another. But how? I had no job, no resources, and no idea how to prove the will was forged. William had covered his tracks. Days blended into nights, nights into weeks, until a jarring thought shook me. If I couldn't beat him in a legal brawl now, maybe there was another way. Maybe I could rise on my own. Survive. Those words, the ones William sneered at me, returned like an ironic mantra. "You'll survive." Fine. I would survive, but I'd do more than that. I'd thrive. And one day he'd regret ever underestimating me. So, I took a job at a small local firm. It was entry-level, nothing glamorous, a position assisting a small team that worked with real estate acquisitions. The pay was meager, but I needed the foot in the door. Maybe I'd learn something about property management, about legal structures, about the kind of knowledge I could use to untangle William's shady dealings. Little did I know how far that first step would take me. My new boss, Sharon, was a sharp-tongued businesswoman who'd clawed her way up from nothing. She saw in me a spark, maybe it was the desperation in my eyes, and threw me more responsibility than I'd ever handled. Paperwork, contract drafting, client relations. I soaked it up. I stayed late, arrived early, studied property law in my off hours, devoured every piece of knowledge I could glean from Sharon and her staff. At first, the job was humbling. There I was, a grown woman who had once believed I'd be financially set for life through inheritance, now fetching coffee and filing documents. But bit by bit, I learned. I realized how property deeds could be manipulated, how inheritance battles often came down to technicalities, how clever lawyers discovered hidden holes in other people's claims. Months turned into a year. My bitterness at William fueled me like a quiet engine, pushing me to read more, do more, accomplish more. I built relationships with everyone I met, realtors, brokers, developers, paralegals. I'd meet them for lunch and pick their brains. Each day, I'd return to my tiny apartment, open a battered notebook, and scribble down everything I'd learned about acquisitions, disputes, wills, trusts, anything that could one day help me reclaim what was mine. During that time, William was gallivanting around town with Dad's money. He sold off a handful of Dad's old businesses, small ventures Dad had invested in here and there. He lived in the family home like a king. Locals talked about the flashy car he bought, the lavish vacations he took. At one point, rumor had it he tried to invest in a shady overseas project and lost a chunk of money, but it barely dented his bank account. I'd see him around occasionally, stepping into clubs or fancy restaurants, always with a grin, always with that polished arrogance. And whenever we crossed paths on the street at the grocery store, he'd toss me that same sneer. "You managing okay?" he'd ask mockingly. "Need a loan?" I never rose to the bait. I'd say, "I'm fine," and walk away. But inside, the anger festered. 2 years into my new life, something happened that changed everything. Sharon's company had a new client, an elderly widow named Mrs. Green, who owned a large tract of land right outside the city. Land her children wanted to sell. Land that a major developer was eyeing. My job was to facilitate the sale, gather documents, confirm ownership, handle the negotiations between the widow's family and the buyer. It was a messy deal at first, with the children squabbling, but then Sharon passed me the thick file and said, "You handle it, kid. Let's see what you're made of." I poured myself into that project like it was a lifeline. Day and night, I worked on it, scheduling meetings with the widow's children, making sure every detail was transparent, ensuring the potential developer's offer was fair. The deal became complicated. Some old tax liens, a boundary dispute with an adjacent property, contradictory appraisals. Normally Sharon would step in, but she let me navigate it. "Trial by fire," she said, with a wink. In those late nights spent buried in records, I realized how easily property could be twisted by the unscrupulous. My mind drifted back to Dad's will. If forging or altering property documents was this possible, Was that how William had pulled it off? Anyway, the green deal eventually closed, with me orchestrating the final handshake in Sharon's big conference room. The sale netted our firm a hefty commission. And to my shock, Sharon gave me a bonus, 5 figures. It was more money than I'd ever held in my life, earned through my own skill. That night, I stared at the check in disbelief. My first instinct was to pay off debts, maybe buy a better car, move to a nicer place. Then I paused. What about investing? What if I could multiply this money, use it for a bigger step forward? I ended up finding a small property in a developing neighborhood on the outskirts of town, an old duplex badly in need of renovation. The seller was desperate. I'd gleaned enough from my job to see the potential. So instead of upgrading my life, I sank every dollar of my bonus into that duplex. The result was a whirlwind. I took out a modest loan to finance renovations. I spent weekends painting, installing new fixtures, scrubbing floors. I tapped into the knowledge I'd collected from my office. I knew which contractors to trust, which corners not to cut, how to handle zoning permits. After 6 months, the duplex was beautiful, and I rented it out to 2 families, covering my mortgage plus some extra every month. It was a small success, but a spark ignited in me. If I could do this once, why not again? Over the next 3 years, I balanced my day job at Sharon's firm with side ventures in real estate. Slowly, methodically, I built a portfolio. A rundown triplex here, a neglected single-family home there. Each time, I'd invest, renovate, rent, or sell. I'd studied so many strategies under Sharon that I had a mental blueprint for success. I never overextended, never got too flashy. I didn't want William or anyone else to know how far I was climbing. Word got around that I had a knack for turning beaten-down properties into profitable rentals. A few smaller investors approached me, asking if I could manage deals for them. I formed an LLC, quietly, under the radar, and started operating as a property consultant on the side. And each time I closed a profitable flip or locked down a stable rental, I felt a rush of satisfaction. This was my building. This was my success. No one was handing it to me. Meanwhile, William was burning through Dad's fortune at an alarming rate. I didn't have the exact numbers, but rumors flew. He was losing money on poor investments, gambling again, maybe dabbling in questionable business partnerships. He still lived in the main family house, but he was drowning in property taxes and overhead. Yet his pride refused to let him downsize. The lavish vacations continued, the nights out, the showy lifestyle. People whispered that the once lucky heir might be on the brink of financial ruin, but he still had millions. Didn't he? Perhaps not as many as he used to. Occasionally, I'd catch sight of him in the city, either beaming with artificial confidence or scowling into his phone. He never spared me more than a mocking grin, but behind his eyes, I saw worry. That worry only fueled my quiet determination. I kept building. I kept rising. One evening, close to midnight, I was deep in some spreadsheets for a new property deal when it struck me. The bigger my network grew, the more resources I had to investigate Dad's will. For years, that idea of contesting the will had hovered in the back of my mind. But I'd told myself it was too expensive, too complicated, a lost cause. Now though, I had the capital. I had the connections, property attorneys, forensic experts, a paper trail I might be able to trace. What if the will William presented was indeed forged? I'd have the means to prove it, or at least try. If I could gather enough evidence to question the validity of that document, the estate might be reevaluated. Even if I couldn't recover Dad's entire fortune, I could at least get justice. But was it worth it? After all, I was doing well on my own, arguably better than I would have if William hadn't taken everything. But it was about principle, about Dad's memory, about the promise I made to keep William close, though this method of keeping him close was more about holding him accountable. So, at nearly 3 a.m., I made a decision. I'd quietly start collecting every scrap of evidence. I'd contact the old attorney who handled Dad's previous wills. I'd see if any staff at the hospice or the bank recalled Dad's mental state or transactions in those final weeks. If William had forged or coerced Dad's final testament, maybe someone had seen something. I'd keep it secret. I didn't want William to get wind of my investigation and bury me in legal threats right away. No, I'd build an airtight case first. And if my gut feeling was right, that the will was fraudulent, then I'd bring the hammer down. It started slowly. phone calls to Dad's old lawyer, who was semi-retired, meeting him for coffee in a dusty diner off the interstate. He remembered me, remembered Dad, remembered bits about the estate. I was surprised, he said, when I heard about that final will. Your father never mentioned such big changes. I asked if Dad had ever brought up cutting me out. The lawyer shook his head. Not once. Fact, he seemed determined to provide equally for both you and William. Always said you were the rock of the family. Those words made me blink back tears. The lawyer didn't have the updated will in his records, which wasn't surprising. William had used someone else. But he had drafts from only a month before Dad passed away, all naming me as co-beneficiary. His voice grew cautious. If that final will was typed up and signed by a new witness, you'd need to check the notary logs, or see if the signature matches your father's older documents. My heart thumped. Dad's signature. The final copy I'd seen had looked off, but I hadn't examined it closely at the time. I just chalked it up to Dad's shaky health. But maybe it wasn't his signature at all. I started building a folder. Scanned copies of all Dad's old signatures, a timeline of his final month, statements from his doctors about his mental capacity. Meanwhile, in my day job and real estate dealings, I kept a friendly, calm face, never hinting at the swirling investigation behind the scenes. In the following weeks, I located the nurse who cared for Dad at the end. She was retired now, living a few towns away. She remembered me, and after I reassured her I just wanted closure, she admitted, "Your dad was in a bad state that last week, confused, forgetful. Some days, he didn't even know what year it was." I jotted that down. A man in that condition could not legally sign a new will, especially not without raised eyebrows from the care staff. "Did you see my brother around?" I asked quietly. She hesitated. "Yes, he was there one afternoon talking to your dad. That was the day your father was the most disoriented I'd ever seen him, rambling about old memories, barely coherent." She shook her head. "I told Mr. William that your dad needed rest, but he insisted on talking business." My jaw tightened. I asked if there was a notary or any official witness that day. The nurse shrugged. "Not that I saw, but one of William's friends came by, I think. Tall guy, wore a black jacket. He went in with William for a while, then they left together." The puzzle pieces started snapping into place. As I got closer to the truth, my anger grew. Each conversation confirmed my suspicion. William had manipulated Dad, possibly on a day he was barely lucid, to sign something. Or maybe Dad didn't sign at all, and William's buddy just forged it. Around this time, word of my budding success in real estate reached William's ears. I heard from mutual acquaintances that he'd begun complaining about me, mocking me as a wannabe mogul, rolling his eyes at my little property flips. But there was an undercurrent of anxiety in his jabs, as though he realized I was no longer the powerless sister he'd left behind. "You'll survive," had become my motto. And I was thriving. Then, out of the blue, William called me. It was the first time we'd spoken on the phone in years. I stared at his number flashing on the screen, heart pounding, before pressing answer. "Ava," he said, using my name for once, "I hear you're doing well with these real estate deals. That's impressive." There was a tightness in his voice, like he was forcing himself to compliment me. "What do you want, William?" A dry chuckle. "So suspicious, sis." "Actually, I was thinking we could talk about a partnership. I've got some ideas about properties. Father left me with a fair bit of capital, you know." I nearly laughed out loud. Father left him capital? More like he stole it. But I bit my tongue. "I'm not interested," I said flatly. A pause. Then he tried another angle. "Look, I know things haven't been great between us, but we're still family. Let's meet, talk about potential collaborations. Could be beneficial for both of us." Everything in me screamed that this was a trap. But the part of me that wanted closure, that wanted to see what he was up to, said yes. "Fine," I told him. "We can meet for coffee, tomorrow, 3 p.m. The next day, I arrived early at a chic coffee shop downtown, one of those places with exposed brick and overpriced lattes. William walked in 10 minutes late, wearing a designer suit but looking haggard around the eyes, like he hadn't slept. He flashed me a tight smile, as though trying to pretend we hadn't been estranged for years. "Ava," he said, settling into the chair across from me. I nodded, not bothering with small talk. "What's this about?" He launched into a rambling speech about wanting to invest in real estate, about how he'd admired my growth, about how we could combine resources to honor Dad's memory by expanding the family name into property developments. I had to clench my jaw to keep from hurling the hot coffee in his face. But I let him talk, carefully noting the hints in his words. He was strapped for cash. His capital was a fraction of what it once was. He needed a partner, likely to bail him out of his failing ventures. When he finished, I calmly stirred my latte. William, you took everything from Dad's estate. You told me I'd survive, so I have, without any of your help. Why would I trust you now? He bristled, posture stiffening. That was a misunderstanding, Ava. Things were complicated back then. I cut him off. No, they weren't. You manipulated Dad. He died believing we'd be equal heirs. Then you produced that final will. You took it all. End of story. His jaw clenched. I saw the flicker of guilt, or maybe just fear. Fine, he muttered. I did what I had to do. Look, if you won't partner with me, at least consider lending me some funds. I'll pay you back with interest. With your skills, we could. I laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. You want me to lend you money? From the small success I built with my own 2 hands because you burned through the fortune you stole? That's hysterical. His face turned red. Don't say it like that. It wasn't theft, it was Dad's will. I tilted my head. Was it? For a split second he froze, a flicker of panic in his eyes. Then he pressed his lips together. I don't know what you're implying. Dad signed it. It's legal. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. I have nothing to offer you, William. And if you really want to honor Dad's memory, maybe you should think about giving me back my half of the inheritance. He scoffed. After all this time? As if. Without another word, he stood and stomped out of the coffee shop, leaving his untouched espresso behind. People glanced at me curiously. I sipped my latte, adrenaline pulsing through my veins. If he'd come to me for help, he must be in worse shape than I realized. And that meant it was almost time for me to strike. My first call was to Sharon. She'd become more than a boss. She was a mentor and friend. I told her vaguely that I was dealing with a potential inheritance dispute and might need forensic analysis of a signature. She didn't press for details. She just connected me to a reputable document expert who specialized in identifying forgery. The document expert, a quiet older man named Gregory, was meticulous. I emailed him scans of Dad's various wills, along with the suspicious final version William had produced. Gregory promised to examine the signatures, compare them with Dad's known handwriting, and provide a full report. While Gregory worked, I reached out to a friend from my property circles, an attorney named Rachel who'd handled estate disputes. Over wine at her condo, I laid out the entire story. Dad's passing, the suspicious will, the details of Dad's mental state, the nurse's testimony, the earlier drafts that named me as co-heir. Rachel's eyes widened with each revelation. Ava, she said when I was done, if this will is indeed a forgery, you might have a strong case to challenge the entire estate distribution. I swallowed. But it's been 5 years, is that even possible? She nodded. Yes, there's no statute of limitations on probate fraud if you have evidence the will was forged, or that your father lacked the mental capacity. You can petition the court to reopen the estate. It'll be a battle, though. You'll need concrete proof. Proof. I was on the brink of getting it. Part of me felt a twist of guilt. Dad's final rest had turned into a legal battleground. But William was the one who started this war. As Gregory analyzed the will, I learned more about William's predicament through the local grapevine. He was desperate. He'd lost money in a shady international investment that never panned out. He was behind on property taxes for the big family house. Word was, the bank was circling like a vulture, about to foreclose if he didn't come current. And still, he refused to scale back his lifestyle. Then out of nowhere, the final blow came. Rumor had it William was putting the family home on the market, the very house we grew up in, the one Dad had built with his own hands. He was so short on cash that he was willing to sell it just to keep his head above water. My heart pounded when I heard. That house was Dad's pride. He'd hammered the nails himself decades ago, laid the foundation brick by brick, telling me stories of how he'd saved money each week to buy supplies. And William was about to sell it to some stranger. No, absolutely not. I called Rachel, my attorney friend, practically breathless. Can we stop him from selling the house? If the will's proven a forgery, that property should be half mine, right? Rachel hesitated. We can file a lis pendens on the property if we open a lawsuit over the estate. That would put a legal cloud on the title, warning any potential buyer that the property's ownership is disputed. If you want to do that, it's time to move. Now. I told her to do it. She warned me this was effectively drawing my sword. Once that filing landed, William would know I was coming for him. No more secrecy. Let him know, I said fiercely. It's time. Within days, Rachel filed the necessary paperwork to challenge the will in probate court, presenting preliminary evidence of potential forgery. She attached statements from the nurse about Dad's mental state, from the old lawyer about Dad's original intent, plus a request for a forensic evaluation of the signature on the final will. Simultaneously, we filed a lis pendens on the family house. This meant any buyer who did a title search would see there was an ongoing legal dispute, and likely back out. William couldn't sell, not unless he managed to beat my claim in court. The backlash was swift. My phone lit up with calls from William, each one more furious than the last. I didn't answer. When that failed, he sent texts hurling insults, calling me a leech, a backstabbing traitor, the works. I swallowed the pain those words caused and pressed forward. Then he did something I half expected. He showed up at my office at Sharon's firm. The receptionist buzzed me, trembling. There's a very angry man here, insisting he has to see you. I'd been so calm up to that point, but hearing he was physically here set my nerves ablaze. Still, I steeled myself. Send him in, I said. William stormed into the conference room, suit disheveled, eyes wild. How dare you, he snarled. I stood, crossing my arms. How dare I what? Demand the truth? He slammed his palms on the table. You have no right to question Dad's will. It's legal, That's for the court to decide, I cut in, refusing to flinch under his rage. If it's so legal, why are you panicking? His nostrils flared. You're causing problems for me, for the sale of the house, for everything. Do you think I won't fight you? I'll bury you in legal fees. I arched an eyebrow. Go ahead, William. I've got a real estate portfolio that can fund a legal battle, and excellent attorneys who are more than ready to stand with me. His expression flickered with shock, as if he hadn't realized I was financially stable enough to push back. He took a step back, lips curling. You want to destroy what's left of this family, is that it? A tremor of sadness tugged at me. You destroyed it the moment you stole everything. I begged you for fairness, for family unity. You slammed the door in my face. He said nothing. But I saw a flicker of something, remorse maybe, in his eyes. It vanished quickly, replaced by cold fury. You'll regret this, he growled. Then he turned on his heel and left. 3 weeks later, Gregory, the document expert, delivered his final report. I met him in a quiet cafe, a booth tucked in the back corner. He handed me a neatly stapled packet. There's a 90% likelihood that the signature on the final will is not your father's, Gregory said in a hushed voice. The pen pressure, angle, letter formations, too inconsistent with your father's known writing. If it is his, it was signed under extreme impairment or forced guidance. Either way, legally suspicious. My heart thudded. This is enough for a judge to look deeper? Gregory nodded. I'd testify to my findings if needed. It felt surreal, like at any moment I'd wake up and realize I was still powerless. But I had proof. William had lied. He'd taken advantage of Dad's confusion or forged the signature altogether. When I gave the report to Rachel, she smiled grimly. This is huge, she said. William's entire claim to the estate is on thin ice now. With this evidence plus the nurse's testimony, we have a strong argument. The judge can void that will. Voiding the will meant we'd revert to the prior valid one, which, according to Dad's old lawyer, split everything 50-50 between me and William. Potentially, I could claim half the estate's current value, house included. Half. After all these years. The morning of the preliminary hearing, I stood outside the old county courthouse, my stomach churning. I'd never set foot in a court for anything so personal. William arrived late, pushing past me without a word. Our lawyers made statements before a judge, a sharp-eyed woman who wasted no time cutting to the heart of the matter. She looked at the evidence, read Gregory's analysis, listened to the nurse's affidavit. William's lawyer sputtered, trying to discredit the nurse, claiming Dad was lucid at times, but they couldn't deny the forensic analysis. The judge ordered a full evidentiary hearing. She also froze any major transactions on the estate, meaning William couldn't sell property or liquidate assets until the matter was resolved. William stormed out of that courtroom like a thundercloud. His lawyer approached Rachel with a forced smile, hinting at a settlement. Rachel relayed the message. William was willing to give me a small sum if I dropped the challenge. "A fraction of what you're owed," Rachel murmured. "He must be desperate." I didn't need time to think. "No deal," I said. In the weeks that followed, William's finances cratered. He'd been counting on selling the family home to stave off debts, but with the will in question, buyers ran for the hills. Creditors circled. His fancy car got repossessed. I expected to feel triumphant, but an odd sadness mingled with my sense of justice. This was my brother, after all, the boy who used to race me across the yard, who taught me how to tie my shoes when I was little. Yet the adult version of him was unrecognizable. Still, I pressed forward. Our attorneys prepared for the evidentiary hearing, where we'd present the forensic evidence and call witnesses. If all went as planned, the judge would deem the final will invalid. Then Dad's older will would take precedence, giving me half the estate, on paper anyway. But that estate was a shadow of its former self. William had sold off assets, wasted money on bad deals. The main house still stood, but it was saddled with back taxes. The bank was threatening foreclosure. The once massive bank accounts were almost drained. Dad's fortune was gone. Rachel tried to comfort me. "You could still get control of the house, maybe some leftover assets. Even if it's not the sum you expected, it's about setting the record straight." She was right. More than money, I craved acknowledgement that William had stolen what Dad intended to be shared. 3 days before the final hearing, I got an urgent call from Rachel. "William wants to meet you, privately." My first reaction was, absolutely not. But Rachel said he sounded frantic, desperate. Curiosity overrode my reluctance. This time I chose the meeting spot. A park near the river, broad daylight, public. He arrived looking disheveled, wearing rumpled clothes, a far cry from the designer suits he once flaunted. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. He sank onto a bench beside me, silent for a few seconds, fiddling with his phone. "I'm done," he said finally, voice hoarse. "I can't fight you anymore. The lawyers, the courts, everything. My life is ruined, Ava. I'm drowning in debt. The house is worthless with the back taxes. The bank will repossess it. The rest of Dad's money is gone." He swallowed, glancing at me. Maybe I deserved this. Maybe I messed up. I let out a shaky breath. Hearing him admit it, the faint flicker of remorse almost tore open old wounds. "I never wanted to ruin you, William," I said. "I just wanted what Dad intended." He nodded, eyes cast to the ground. "I forged the signature," he mumbled. "Or, well, my friend did, but I made it happen. Dad barely knew what day it was by then. I thought I deserved it, you know? Izuski was always praising you. I was the screw-up. I just wanted—" He cut himself off, jaw tightening. "Wanted control. Wanted to prove I could have everything for once." Those words twisted my heart. But I remembered how he'd mocked me, told me I'd survive. This was the same man who left me with nothing, who refused me even a portion of Dad's estate. "I'm sorry," he whispered, voice cracking. "If you drop the suit, I'll transfer the house to you. Let you keep whatever is left." For a long moment, I just stared at him. Was this a trick? Then I realized how far he'd fallen. He had no more illusions of winning. He was surrendering, or trying to. "William," I said slowly, "I don't need you to give me the house. The court will likely do that if we go forward. I'm not dropping the suit, but if you're honest on the stand, we can expedite the process. Maybe the judge will go easier on you. Forgery is a crime." His eyes flickered with fear. "You'd press charges?" I sighed. "I'm not the prosecutor, William. But the court might refer you for investigation if we prove you forged a will. You could face consequences." He covered his face with his hands, shoulders trembling. For a second, I felt the urge to reach out, remind him I was his sister. But I remembered Dad's broken expression on his deathbed, the promise I made. How Dad's final wish had been for us to stand together. And how William had spat on that wish. Still, I found a hint of compassion inside me. "Look," I said softly, "just testify truthfully. We'll let the legal system handle the rest. Maybe you can avoid the worst, but I'm not sweeping this under the rug. You stole from me, from Dad's memory. You threatened to bury me in legal fees. You humiliated me. He nodded, tears wetting his lashes. I know, he whispered, I'm sorry. On the day of the final hearing, William's lawyer announced they were withdrawing defense against my claim. William admitted the final will was invalid, that Dad hadn't been in the right state of mind, that the signature was suspect. The judge asked a few direct questions, and with a shaky voice, William confirmed it was forged. The gavel came down. The final will was voided. Dad's older, rightful will was reinstated. Legally, half the estate was mine. Only problem? The estate's coffers were empty. All that remained of real value was the family house, which was on the brink of foreclosure. That day, the judge also flagged William's confession for possible criminal charges, but that was for the district attorney to decide. My face felt numb as we left the courtroom. The media didn't care about some local inheritance fight, so the hall was quiet, save for the shuffle of footsteps. Rachel touched my shoulder. You did it, she whispered. You won. Won, but the victory felt hollow. Dad's money was gone. My brother was broken. Our family name was tarnished. William stood at the end of the hall, avoiding my gaze. His lawyer patted his back before walking away. Slowly, William approached, shoulders slumped. So, it's yours, he said dully. The house, or whatever is left. I exhaled. It's not about the house, William. It was about setting Dad's will right. He nodded, eyes on the floor. I guess, thank you for not pushing for the maximum penalties. I was too tired to be angry anymore. I did what I had to do. And with that, we parted ways, each bearing the weight of Dad's legacy in our own fractured hearts. I petitioned the court to stop the foreclosure and began negotiations with the bank. I had enough resources, thanks to my real estate successes, to cover the back taxes and the overdue mortgage. It stung to write those checks, but I couldn't bear letting the house be lost to some opportunistic buyer. This was Dad's house. Once it was secure, I stood in the living room, gazing at the sunlit walls, the dusty furniture. The memories washed over me. Dad teaching me to waltz in this very spot. Mom decorating for the holidays. The floors creaked exactly the way I remembered. Everything smelled like nostalgia, tinged with a faint sadness that Dad wasn't here to see me reclaim it. I had two options, keep it or sell it. Part of me wanted to walk away from the pain, but a stronger part felt that letting it go meant letting William's betrayal define the end. So I decided to renovate it, give it new life. Over the next year, I threw myself into restoring the house. I fixed the roof, refinished the floors, repaired old windows. Sometimes I'd sit on the porch at dusk, sipping iced tea, thinking about how Dad used to watch the sunset from that exact spot. The neighbors, who remembered me from childhood, would stop by to say hello and marvel at the transformation. William never visited. The only times I heard about him were through mutual acquaintances. He was renting a tiny apartment, drifting between jobs, still dogged by lawsuits from creditors. Occasionally, I'd get calls from those creditors, apparently confused about the estate, but I'd explain that William no longer had anything to do with my share. I heard rumors that the DA's office had decided not to press criminal charges, citing the complexity of the case and William's battered financial state. Perhaps they saw no point in imprisoning a man who'd effectively destroyed himself. 6 months into renovating, I moved in. I shifted my base of operations to the house. A new life, a new beginning. My property consulting business was thriving by then. I had a growing list of clients, a small team working under me, and I was finalizing a partnership with Sharon's firm to handle bigger development projects. One afternoon, as I was reviewing paperwork in Dad's old study, the doorbell rang. I glanced at the clock, surprised. 3 p.m. on a Wednesday. When I opened the door, William stood on the porch. It was the first time he'd seen the house since I'd saved it from foreclosure. His eyes flickered over the fresh paint, the repaired porch swing, the new landscaping. Looks different, he muttered. I nodded. I've been busy. Silence hung between us. He looked thinner, older, haunted. Finally, he said, Can I come in? I hesitated, then stepped aside. He followed me into the living room, the floors gleaming with fresh polish. The air felt oddly charged with the past and present colliding. William took a slow breath, then lowered himself onto the edge of an armchair. I'm sorry for everything, he said quietly, his voice heavy. I know that's probably not enough, but I had to say it. I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorway. You already apologized once, then you used it as leverage. What's different now? He shook his head. Nothing, except I lost everything, Ava. Everything. Dad, the money, my reputation, my sense of self, and I know it's my fault. I see that now. I studied him. The anger in me, though still smoldering, was softened by a weary empathy. So why are you here? He swallowed. I don't have the right to ask you for anything. But I had nowhere else to go, and I thought maybe, if there was a chance. My throat tightened. A chance for what? He grimaced. A chance to reconnect. Not for money. I swear. I miss having a sister. Those words hung in the air, stirring a swirl of emotions. A part of me wanted to shout at him, remind him how he abandoned me. Another part remembered the times we'd laughed together as kids. For a long time, I just breathed, steadying myself. You stole our inheritance, I said, voice calm but firm. You left me with nothing and told me, you'll survive. Then you spent years mocking me. He bowed his head, shame flickering in his eyes. I know, it's inexcusable. I did survive, I continued, because I worked hard alone with no help from you, and karma came for you. Now you're here, wanting me to forgive? He exhaled shakily. I don't deserve forgiveness, but I'd like a chance to earn it, if that's possible. I looked at him for a long time. Memories of Dad's final request echoed in my mind. Keep William close. It was complicated. William wasn't some storybook villain or an irredeemable monster. He was my brother, a flawed human who'd done terrible things. He'd faced the consequences. Slowly, I felt a weight lift from my chest. I was no longer that powerless woman in the living room, begging for her share. I was strong, stable, successful in my own right. William's apology wouldn't fix the pain, but maybe it could start the healing. So I nodded, just once. We can talk, I said quietly. I'm not promising I'll ever forget what you did. But maybe we can start somewhere. It's been 2 years since that day. William never asked me for money. At least, not after that first conversation. Instead, he began a long, slow path to rebuilding his life. He took an entry-level job in a construction firm, ironically assisting with projects similar to mine. He sold off every last remnant of his old possessions, clearing his debts over time. Meanwhile, my property consulting business expanded exponentially. I teamed up with Sharon's firm, launching a new branch focused on restoring and preserving family homes. Dad's old house became the inspiration for that project, a symbol of how something broken could be made whole again, if one was willing to fight for it. And yes, Dad's memory looms large in every corner of that house. Sometimes, when I'm sitting on the porch swing at sunset, I sense him smiling. I think he'd be proud that I managed to build a life on my own terms, even if it came from heartbreak. William and I see each other occasionally now. Sometimes I invite him over for dinner. Or he helps me with small repair projects around the neighborhood. We're not best friends, there's still a chasm forged by years of resentment. But we talk. We share quiet moments remembering Mom and Dad. We're civil. Maybe one day, we'll even feel like siblings again. Maybe. People ask me if I regret not just letting it go. After all, the inheritance I finally claimed was only a fraction of what it was worth originally. Was the legal fight worth it? My answer is always yes. Because it wasn't just about the money. It was about the principle, about restoring Dad's true legacy, about proving that I wouldn't be erased, that I refused to vanish under someone else's greed. In the end, William learned the hard way that you can't steal from family, can't build your future on a lie. Karma had its way with him. He lost nearly everything. But strangely enough, that loss might have been what saved him, forced him to confront the darkness within himself. It doesn't excuse his actions, but it does allow for the faint hope of redemption. As for me, I've survived and thrived, just like he said I would. Only now, I wear that survival not as a mark of shame but as a badge of honor. I built my own fortune in real estate, discovered a skill and passion I never would have if William hadn't pushed me into a corner. I reclaimed the family home, shaping it into a place of comfort rather than sorrow. Sometimes life's cruelest twists become our greatest catalysts for growth. In my case, losing my inheritance forced me to find a deeper strength. So yes, I survived, William. And I always will. Because in the end, you can't bury the truth, and you can't keep down someone who's determined to rise.